Winter settled over Blackthorn Hall with the deceptive elegance of fresh snow covering a battlefield. Beyond the towering windows, moonlight silvered the frozen gardens and sculpted the hedges into ghostly monuments. Inside, beneath crystal chandeliers and gilded ceilings, hundreds of candles burned with unwavering brilliance as England's aristocracy gathered for the grand midwinter ball hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorn. To every observer, it appeared to be a celebration of prosperity, influence, and domestic happiness. The Duchess stood at the top of the marble staircase, her gloved hand resting lightly upon the polished banister. Her ivory gown flowed around her in soft folds, carefully tailored to conceal nothing of her condition. 7 months pregnant, she carried herself with the quiet dignity expected of a future mother to Blackthorn's heir. Jewels sparkled at her throat, but they were insignificant beside the gentle light in her blue eyes. Her name was Eleanor Ashford Blackthorn. For nearly 3 years she had been the Duke's wife. For nearly 3 years she had loved him. And for nearly 3 years she had wondered whether he could ever truly love her in return. The orchestra began a waltz below. Guests admired her beauty. Ladies complimented her grace. Elderly dowagers whispered approvingly about the approaching heir. Everywhere she turned, smiles greeted her. Yet one absence shadowed the evening. Her husband. The Duke had spent most of the ball away from her side. Once that would not have troubled her. Their marriage had begun as a practical alliance between respected families. Affection had not been expected. But recently something had changed. Or so she had believed. Over the past several months he had become unexpectedly attentive. He asked about her health. He lingered beside her during dinners. He accompanied her on carriage rides through Hyde Park. Sometimes she even caught him watching her with an unreadable expression that made her dare to hope. Hope was a dangerous thing, especially for a woman who had survived years on crumbs of affection. That morning the physician had delivered wonderful news. Both mother and child were thriving. There was every indication the baby would be healthy, possibly even a son. The folded report rested safely inside her reticule. She had spent the entire day imagining how she would tell him. Perhaps after the final dance. Perhaps beside the fire when the guests departed. Perhaps he would smile. Perhaps he would finally look at her not as an obligation but as the family he had created. The possibility had warmed her heart through the long evening. When the final set of dances began, Eleanor noticed the Duke slipping through a side corridor. Without thinking she followed. The farther she walked from the ballroom, the quieter the mansion became. Music faded into distant echoes. Candlelight softened. The warmth of celebration gave way to the stillness of private chambers. At the end of the corridor stood the library. The door was slightly open. Laughter drifted through the narrow gap. A woman's laughter. Eleanor slowed. Something cold touched the back of her neck. The voice belonged to Lady Vivian Mercer, a widowed beauty whose presence had become increasingly common at Blackthorn Hall. Eleanor had never liked the woman. Vivian possessed the dangerous charm of someone who understood precisely how much power beauty could purchase. Another laugh emerged. Then the Duke's voice. Oh, comfortable. Intimate. Eleanor moved closer without meaning to. The sight waiting beyond the door stopped her breathing. Vivian sat beside the Duke on a velvet sofa before the library fire. They were positioned far closer than propriety allowed. Her hand rested lightly upon his sleeve. Neither appeared eager to move away. For a moment Eleanor could only stare. The room seemed unreal. A painted scene behind glass. Then Vivian smiled and tilted her head. "What of your wife?" she asked softly. The question hung between them. Eleanor waited. Every heartbeat felt enormous. The Duke glanced toward the fire. A faint smile touched his lips. Then he spoke 7 words that shattered the foundation of her world. "She means nothing to me at all." Silence followed. Not shocked silence. Comfortable silence. The silence of 2 people who considered the matter settled. Eleanor felt the physician's report slip from her fingers. The folded paper fluttered soundlessly onto the carpet. Inside her the child moved. The sensation nearly broke her. Vivian laughed again. The Duke reached across the space between them and covered her hand with his own. The gesture lasted only seconds. It was enough. Years of uncertainty suddenly arranged themselves into a cruel pattern. Every missed anniversary. Every lonely dinner. Every conversation cut short. Every glance she had pretended not to notice. The truth stood before her with merciless clarity. She had loved a man who had never chosen her. A floorboard creaked beneath her shoe. Fear surged through her. Before either occupant noticed her presence, she stepped away from the doorway and retreated down the corridor. Her movements remained calm, measured, dignified. Only her heart was running. Minutes later she returned to the ballroom. Nobody suspected anything. She smiled when spoken to, accepted congratulations, danced once with an elderly lord. thanked guests for attending. The performance was flawless. Only the Duke failed to notice that she never once sought his gaze again. Near midnight she stood alone before the mirror in her private chamber. Candlelight trembled across the glass. The woman reflected there looked exactly as she had hours earlier. Yet everything was different. Slowly she removed her wedding ring. A single tear escaped despite her efforts. She stared at her reflection, placed one hand over the child beneath her heart, and whispered into the silence, "Then I shall become nothing." Before dawn, while Blackthorn Hall still slept, the Duchess quietly left her bedchamber carrying only a small traveling case, leaving behind a ring, a marriage, and a husband who did not yet know he had spoken the words that would cost him everything. The morning after the midwinter ball arrived beneath a sky the color of cold steel. Frost clung to the windows of Blackthorn Hall, and a pale silence lingered over the estate as servants moved through corridors still scented with candle wax and fading roses. The grandeur of the previous evening seemed strangely distant, as though the celebration had belonged to another lifetime. Duke Alexander Blackthorn awoke later than usual. For several moments he remained unaware that anything had changed. He dressed, reviewed correspondence, and accepted his morning coffee with the same detached efficiency that governed most aspects of his life. Only when he crossed into the adjoining chamber did he notice the unusual stillness. Eleanor's room was empty. Her maid stood near the dressing table, visibly unsettled. "She is not here, Your Grace." Alexander frowned. "Where has she gone?" "We do not know." The answer irritated him more than it alarmed him. His wife occasionally sought solitude in the gardens or chapel when her pregnancy exhausted her. He assumed she would return shortly. Then he saw the ring. It rested atop a folded white handkerchief on her dressing table. The gold band gleamed in the weak winter light. Alexander stared at it. A faint unease settled inside him. For the first time that morning he looked closely around the room. Several personal belongings were missing. Not many. Only enough to suggest intention. The realization sharpened his expression. "Search the grounds," he ordered. Within an hour the household had been mobilized. Servants combed the gardens. Stable boys checked the roads. Carriages were accounted for. No one had seen the Duchess leave. It was as though she had vanished into the darkness itself. By evening, concern had replaced irritation. By the second day, concern had become something far more difficult to name. The Duchess of Blackthorn had disappeared. The news spread through London with astonishing speed. Aristocratic drawing rooms buzzed with speculation. Some claimed she had suffered a nervous collapse. Others insisted she had fled with a secret lover. Several particularly cruel voices suggested the Duke himself had driven her away. Every version of the story grew more dramatic with each retelling. Alexander ignored the gossip publicly. Privately, he ordered investigators across England. Letters were sent. Inquiries made. Roadhouses questioned. Nothing emerged. No trace. No witness. No explanation. The mystery deepened when his financial secretary delivered an unexpected report. The Duchess had withdrawn almost no money before leaving. No hidden accounts had been touched. No jewels of significant value were missing. She had not fled in preparation for a new life. She had simply gone. The discovery disturbed him more than he admitted. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Eleanor stepped from a stagecoach into a windswept coastal village where nobody knew her title. The sea stretched endlessly beyond jagged cliffs. Salt filled the air. Gray waves crashed against black stone. The village possessed none of the elegance of Blackthorn Hall. Its cottages were small. Its roads muddy. Its people practical. For the first time in years, nobody bowed when she entered a room. Nobody watched her. Nobody expected perfection. She introduced herself using her maiden name and rented a modest cottage overlooking the harbor. The home contained only 3 rooms. A narrow bed. A worn table. A small fireplace. Yet the simplicity felt strangely comforting. She cried her first night there. Not because she regretted leaving. Because she finally stopped pretending she was happy. The following weeks became an exercise in survival. She learned how to stretch every coin. She walked through village markets unnoticed. She watched fishing boats disappear into dawn mist. Sometimes loneliness settled over her like heavy rain. Sometimes freedom felt miraculous. The child growing within her remained her constant purpose. When fear threatened to overwhelm her, she rested both hands upon her stomach and reminded herself why she had left. A child deserved love. A child deserved certainty. A child deserved better than hearing his father speak those 7 words. Back at Blackthorn Hall, winter yielded slowly to spring. Alexander attempted to resume normal life. Yet normality refused to return. Lady Vivian Mercer remained a frequent presence. What had once felt entertaining now felt exhausting. Her laughter grated against his nerves. Her endless ambition became impossible to ignore. She spoke increasingly about the future. About marriage. About titles. About influence. Alexander found himself listening less each day. One afternoon he entered the library where Eleanor had often spent her evenings. An unfinished piece of embroidery remained beside the window. A book rested where she had left it. Pressed flowers marked a page halfway through. The sight struck him unexpectedly. For several moments he stood motionless. The room felt inhabited by absence. He began noticing similar remnants throughout the estate. A shawl folded beside a chair. A favorite teacup. Handwritten notes tucked inside household ledgers. Evidence of a woman who had quietly woven herself into every corner of the house. And evidence of how little attention he had paid. Months passed. Summer arrived. Then autumn. The Duchess remained missing. The scandal refused to die. Newspapers speculated endlessly about the fate of Blackthorn's unborn heir. Parliament debated inheritance complications. Society treated the mystery as entertainment. Only those closest to the situation understood its growing tragedy. Then, on a rain-soaked evening nearly 10 months after Eleanor's disappearance, a sealed letter arrived at Blackthorn Hall. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The postmark belonged to a distant coastal region. Alexander broke the seal immediately. His eyes scanned the brief message. The writer revealed almost nothing. No names. No address. No signature. Only a single sentence. Your wife survived the birth and delivered a healthy son. For a long moment, the Duke simply stared at the words. Somewhere beyond the rain-streaked windows, his child was alive. Somewhere in England, Eleanor was raising the heir he had never seen. And for the first time since she vanished, hope entered the darkness, followed immediately by a more terrifying realization. Someone knew exactly where she was. And they were determined that he would not. 2 years passed beneath the restless skies of England. Seasons arrived and departed with indifferent precision. Snow surrendered to spring blossoms. Summer painted the countryside in gold. Autumn stripped the trees bare again. Across those changing landscapes, one truth remained constant. The Duchess of Blackthorn had vanished. For most of society, the scandal gradually transformed into legend. New controversies emerged. New marriages were celebrated. New fortunes rose and collapsed. The aristocracy's attention drifted elsewhere. But for Alexander Blackthorn, time refused to move forward. The anonymous letter confirming the existence of his son had altered something fundamental within him. The child was real. Not an abstraction. Not an heir written into legal documents. A living boy somewhere beyond his reach. And Eleanor was raising him alone. The realization haunted him. At first, he pursued information with a cold determination that had built his reputation. Investigators traveled throughout England. Rewards were offered discreetly. Court records were examined. Midwives questioned. Parish registries searched. Every effort ended in failure. Whoever protected Eleanor did so with remarkable loyalty. Months stretched into years. Eventually the search became less public and more personal. Alexander no longer wanted merely to locate his wife. He wanted to understand why she had left without a single word. That question followed him through every corridor of Blackthorn Hall. One rainy evening he entered his private study carrying a box that had remained untouched since Eleanor's disappearance. Her letters. Dozens of them. Notes she had written during their courtship. Correspondence exchanged during brief separations. Cards attached to birthday gifts. Messages he had once skimmed without thought. The fire crackled softly as he opened the first letter. Then another. Then another. Hours slipped away unnoticed. For the first time he truly read them. Eleanor's voice emerged from every page. Gentle. Hopeful. Patient. Painfully sincere. She wrote about books she loved. Gardens she wished to plant. Places she hoped they might someday visit together. Small observations about ordinary days. And hidden between the lines was something he had never bothered to see. Love. Not dramatic declarations. Not childish infatuation. Something deeper. Steadier. A devotion that had endured despite neglect. The discovery unsettled him more than anger ever could. Memories began resurfacing with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered evenings when she waited for him beside the fire. Dinners where she attempted conversation while he remained distracted. Walks she suggested that he declined. Moments she reached toward him emotionally only to encounter distance. At the time he had viewed those moments as insignificant. Now they returned carrying the weight of accumulated regret. Meanwhile, far from Blackthorn Hall, Eleanor's life followed a very different rhythm. The sea remained her constant companion. The cottage overlooking the harbor had become a home. Not a grand home. Not a noble home. But a peaceful one. Her son filled it with life. Thomas Ashford was nearly 2 years old. He possessed dark hair, curious eyes, and an endless fascination with the world around him. Every morning he raced toward the shoreline as though the ocean belonged exclusively to him. Every evening he returned covered in sand, questions, and laughter. Eleanor adored him. He was the brightest light she had ever known. Yet even joy could not entirely erase old wounds. Sometimes she watched him sleeping and wondered what kind of father he might have become under different circumstances. Not the Duke. The man she had once believed existed beneath the title. The man she had hoped to love. She rarely allowed herself those thoughts. They served no purpose. The past could not be rewritten, only endured. One afternoon, while rain tapped gently against the cottage windows, Thomas sat beside the fireplace drawing shapes upon scraps of paper. His concentration lasted several minutes. Then he glanced upward. "Mother?" "Yes, darling?" "Do I have a father?" The question arrived so suddenly that her breath caught. She set aside her sewing. "You do." "Where is he?" Eleanor searched for words. The truth felt too heavy for such a small child. "He lives far away." Thomas considered this. "Does he know me?" The innocence of the question pierced her heart. She looked toward the fire. For years she had prepared herself for this conversation. Nothing had prepared her for hearing it spoken aloud. "No," she said quietly. The boy frowned. "Why not?" A long silence followed. Outside, waves crashed against distant rocks. Inside, Eleanor faced the consequence of choices she still believed were necessary. Finally she knelt before her son. Because sometimes grown people make mistakes. Big mistakes. "Yes." Thomas nodded solemnly. Then came the question she feared most. Did father not want us? The room seemed to stop moving. For a moment Eleanor could not speak. The cruelty of those 7 words echoed through memory exactly as it had 2 years earlier. She remembered the library, the firelight, the laughter, the certainty with which Alexander had dismissed her existence. Yet she refused to burden her son with that pain. She gently touched his cheek. "Your father does not know you," she said softly. "That is not the same thing." Thomas appeared satisfied by the answer. Children often accepted mysteries that adults could not. Minutes later he returned to his drawings. Eleanor watched him quietly. Then, when he was no longer looking, tears filled her eyes. Back in London, another revelation awaited Alexander. While reviewing archived household records, an elderly servant requested a private audience. The woman had worked at Blackthorn Hall for decades. Her loyalty was unquestioned. Her expression carried unusual gravity. "There is something your grace should see." She handed him a sealed envelope. Alexander recognized it immediately. The physician's report. The document Eleanor had intended to show him on the night she disappeared. His pulse quickened. Slowly he unfolded the paper. The physician's observations confirmed excellent health, a strong pregnancy, excellent development, and a final handwritten note addressed specifically to the Duke. "Your wife was eager to share this news personally. She believes the child may be a son." The word struck with devastating force. Suddenly every piece of the puzzle aligned. The ball, the library, the mistress, the 7 words, and the report that had fallen from Eleanor's hand moments before her world collapsed. She had been searching for him. She had been carrying joyful news. And he had destroyed that moment forever. Alexander lowered the paper. His vision blurred. For years he had blamed confusion, pride, and circumstance. Now excuses vanished. At last he understood exactly when he lost his wife. Exactly when he lost his son. And for the first time since childhood, the Duke of Blackthorn bowed his head and wept. When the storm of grief finally subsided, he noticed something else inside the envelope. A small slip of paper tucked behind the report. Upon it was written the name of a coastal parish. The first real clue anyone had discovered in more than 2 years. And somewhere beside that distant sea, entirely unaware that the hunt had begun again, a little boy with his father's eyes was waiting to be found. The journey to the coastal parish took 3 days. 3 days of relentless wind, rain-darkened roads, and thoughts Alexander Blackthorn could no longer escape. The slip of paper remained folded inside his coat pocket throughout the journey. He touched it repeatedly as though afraid it might vanish and take his final hope with it. For more than 2 years he had searched for Ghost. Now he was chasing something infinitely more dangerous. The truth. On the evening of the 3rd day, his carriage descended a narrow road overlooking a restless sea. Gray clouds hung low above the horizon. White waves battered the cliffs below. Fishing boats swayed within a small harbor sheltered by black stone breakwaters. The village appeared modest and weathered, built by people who measured life through storms survived rather than titles inherited. Alexander stepped from the carriage. Salt filled the air. For a long moment he simply stood there, studying the unfamiliar place. Somewhere among those cottages lived the woman he had failed. Somewhere nearby lived the son he had never held. The realization tightened his chest. A local shopkeeper eventually directed him toward a small cottage overlooking the shoreline. His pulse quickened with every step. Then something unexpected happened. A child darted across the path ahead of him. The boy could not have been older than 2. Dark hair, quick movements, fearless curiosity. He ran toward the beach with a wooden toy boat clutched in one hand. Alexander watched him instinctively. The child stopped near a tide pool and crouched beside the water. A breeze stirred his hair. The angle of his profile became visible. Alexander froze. The resemblance struck with astonishing force. Not because the child looked identical to him. Because he looked familiar in dozens of tiny ways. The shape of his eyes. The tilt of his head. The stubborn concentration etched across his face. For a moment the world seemed strangely quiet. The boy glanced upward. Their eyes met. Neither understood why the moment mattered. Then a woman's voice carried across the wind. "Thomas?" The child immediately turned. Alexander followed his gaze. Everything inside him stopped. Eleanor stood outside a small whitewashed cottage overlooking the sea. Time had changed her. Not diminished her. Changed her. The fragile uncertainty that once shadowed her expression was gone. She looked stronger now. Calmer. More certain of herself. Her dark cloak moved in the wind as she crossed the yard toward her son. Thomas ran into her arms. She lifted him effortlessly. The sight carried a simple intimacy more powerful than any grand gesture. Mother and child. A complete world. A world that had learned to exist without him. Alexander remained motionless long after they disappeared inside. Only when dusk began settling over the coastline did he finally approach the cottage. A warm glow flickered behind the curtains. The scent of wood smoke drifted from the chimney. Everything about the place felt ordinary. Everything about it felt precious. He raised his hand and knocked. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Eleanor looked up. The color drained from her face. For several seconds neither spoke. Shock transformed gradually into disbelief. Then disbelief hardened into caution. "Alexander." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I found you." The words sounded inadequate the moment they left him. A painful silence followed. Rain tapped softly against the roof. Far below, waves crashed against distant rocks. Eleanor tightened her grip on the door. "You should leave." "I cannot." "You can." "Not this time." The answer lingered between them. She studied him carefully. Not the title. Not the reputation. The man standing before her. At last she stepped aside. 5 minutes. The cottage interior was modest but warm. Books lined a narrow shelf. Children's drawings decorated one wall. A small fire burned inside the hearth. Evidence of a life built carefully from broken pieces. Thomas peered curiously from behind a chair. Alexander's heart tightened. This was his son. Not a dream. Not a possibility. His son. The child continued studying him. "Who are you?" Alexander struggled to answer. Before he could speak, Eleanor intervened. "A visitor." Thomas accepted the explanation immediately and returned to his toys. The simplicity nearly shattered Alexander. For 2 years he had imagined this moment. Nothing had prepared him for reality. He turned toward Eleanor. "I came to apologize." Her expression remained unreadable. "You crossed half of England for that?" "I crossed half of England because I finally understood what I destroyed." A flicker of pain passed through her eyes. Gone almost instantly. "You are late." Every word carried quiet truth. Alexander lowered his gaze. "I know." "No." She shook her head slowly. "You do not." The room grew still. Eleanor looked toward the fire. "An apology cannot return what died that night." The statement struck harder than anger would have. Because it was honest. The trust she once offered freely had not survived the library. The future she imagined had not survived those 7 words. Some losses could not be undone. Alexander accepted the blow without defense. "You are right." For the first time, surprise appeared on her face. Perhaps she expected excuses, justifications, pride. Instead she found surrender. Over the following days he remained in the village. Not because Eleanor welcomed him. Because she tolerated his presence. There was a difference. He rented a room nearby. Helped repair damaged fishing nets after a storm. Made himself useful. Most importantly, he spent time with Thomas whenever opportunities arose. The child approached him cautiously at first. Then with growing confidence. They walked along the shoreline together. Collected unusual shells. Built miniature boats from driftwood. Alexander discovered laughter came easier around his son than it had in years. One evening Thomas slipped his small hand into Alexander's. The gesture lasted only seconds, yet it nearly brought him to tears. Eleanor witnessed it from a distance. She said nothing, but something within her shifted. Not forgiveness, something quieter. The acknowledgement that her son deserved answers. A week later, after Thomas had fallen asleep, Alexander and Eleanor sat outside beneath a sky crowded with stars. The sea shimmered beyond the cliffs. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally Alexander broke the silence. Those 7 words were spoken by a fool. Eleanor stared toward the horizon. A fool who mistook attention for affection, he continued quietly, and loyalty for certainty. The confession lingered in the night air. For the first time since arriving, she looked directly at him. Regret filled every line of his face. Real regret. The kind that arrived too late. And perhaps because of that honesty, Eleanor finally revealed the secret she had carried for months. A family in Canada had offered her a position managing a large estate. The opportunity promised safety, independence, a future beyond England. She had already accepted. The ship would depart within weeks. And unless something impossible happened before then, Alexander had finally found his wife and son only to discover he was about to lose them forever. The news of Eleanor's departure spread through Alexander's thoughts like a gathering storm. 4 days after her revelation, sleep became impossible. Every ticking second carried the knowledge that a ship waited beyond the horizon. Every sunrise brought him closer to losing his wife and son for a second time. Only now there would be no excuse. No ignorance. No misunderstanding. If they left England, the fault would belong entirely to him. The realization forced him to confront a truth he had spent years avoiding. Love could not be demanded. Forgiveness could not be negotiated. And redemption could not be earned through words spoken in private. He had destroyed Eleanor publicly. The wound had begun in secret, but its consequences had unfolded beneath the gaze of society. Therefore the truth would have to be spoken before that same society. 3 days later he returned to London. Eleanor did not accompany him. She remained by the sea with Thomas, preparing for the journey to Canada. Alexander asked only one thing before leaving. Delay your departure for 1 week. She studied him carefully. Why? Because there is something I must do. And if it changes nothing? His expression remained steady. Then I shall wish you happiness and never trouble you again. The sincerity in his voice unsettled her more than any grand promise. At last she agreed. 1 week. No more. No less. The Duke immediately began arranging an event unlike any Blackthorn Hall had hosted before. Invitations were sent throughout London. Members of Parliament, judges, industrialists, old noble families, journalists, even distant royal representatives. The gathering was officially described as a charitable gala supporting widows and orphan children. The announcement generated enormous interest. Speculation flourished. No one understood why the notoriously private Duke suddenly desired public attention. The answer arrived on the evening of the gala. Blackthorn Hall blazed with light. Crystal chandeliers scattered gold across polished marble floors. Hundreds of guests filled the ballroom. Diamonds sparkled. Silk rustled. Music drifted through the air. Beneath the glamour lurked anticipation. Everyone sensed something unusual. Alexander stood near the grand staircase watching the crowd assemble. He felt strangely calm. Not because he expected success. Because for the first time in years he intended to tell the truth. Eleanor arrived shortly before the formal proceedings began. She wore a deep blue gown that emphasized neither wealth nor status, only quiet dignity. Thomas remained in the care of trusted friends nearby. As she entered the ballroom, conversations softened. Whispers spread rapidly. The vanished Duchess had returned. Many expected scandal. Some expected confrontation. A few anticipated divorce. No one anticipated what followed. Alexander approached her. For a brief moment they stood facing one another amid hundreds of curious eyes. You came. I gave my word. Thank you. The simplicity of the exchange felt oddly intimate. Then he offered his arm. After a long hesitation she accepted. The gesture alone sent murmurs rippling through the crowd. Together they crossed the ballroom. Not as husband and wife. Not yet. Simply as two people carrying the weight of a shared history. When the orchestra fell silent, Alexander ascended the staircase overlooking the ballroom. Every conversation ceased. Every face turned upward. The Duke of Blackthorn rarely addressed society directly. When he did, people listened. For several seconds he said nothing. The silence deepened. Then he began. I invited you here tonight because a false story has been allowed to survive for too long. The crowd remained motionless. Alexander's gaze moved across the room. I speak not as a duke, but as a man who failed where it mattered most. Confusion flickered across several faces. Others leaned forward. The atmosphere tightened. Years of authority had taught Alexander how to command attention. Tonight he used that authority against himself. Many of you know my wife disappeared more than 2 years ago. His eyes found Eleanor. She did not disappear because she was unstable. A murmur spread. She did not disappear because she was unfaithful. The murmuring intensified. She left because I gave her reason to believe she was unwanted. The ballroom fell silent again. The confession landed like thunder. Several aristocrats exchanged shocked glances. Others stared openly. Alexander continued. I allowed another woman to occupy a place she never should have occupied. I neglected the person who deserved my loyalty. I mistook devotion for permanence and assumed forgiveness would always wait for me. Each sentence stripped away another layer of pride. No title could shield him now. No reputation could soften the truth. Eleanor watched from below. Her heart pounded. She had imagined many endings to their story. None resembled this. The Duke drew a slow breath. Then came the moment that transformed the room. 2 years ago, my wife intended to tell me she was carrying our son. A visible ripple moved through the audience. Instead of pausing, he continued. Before she could speak, she overheard me utter 7 words that shattered her trust. The silence became absolute. Alexander's voice lowered. She means nothing to me at all. Several guests looked horrified. Others lowered their eyes. No one could mistake the cruelty. No one could excuse it. For the first time, society heard the truth exactly as it happened. The Duke descended the staircase. Each step echoed across the ballroom. When he reached Eleanor, he stopped. Then, before England's most powerful families, he did something no one expected. He knelt. Gasps erupted throughout the hall. A duke did not kneel publicly. A man like Alexander Blackthorne certainly did not. Yet he remained there. Not because protocol demanded it, because his conscience did. He looked up at Eleanor. The same woman who had once stood outside a library door carrying hope in her hands. The same woman who had walked away carrying heartbreak in their unborn child. The same woman who had somehow found the strength to build a life from ruins. His voice trembled for the first time. She was the finest thing ever entrusted to my care. The words settled over the ballroom. And I was too blind to see it. Tears filled Eleanor's eyes. Not because the pain vanished. Not because the years disappeared. Because he finally understood them. Every lonely dinner. Every unanswered attempt. Every sacrifice. Every silent wound. For the first time he truly saw her. The crowd ceased to exist. Only the two of them remained. Alexander bowed his head. I do not ask for what I have not earned. I do not ask you to forget. I ask only for the chance to spend the rest of my life proving that those 7 words were a lie spoken by a foolish man. Emotion tightened Eleanor's throat. The old version of herself would have accepted immediately. The woman standing here now was different. Stronger. Wiser. Less willing to surrender her dignity. Slowly she extended her hand. Alexander looked up. The ballroom held its breath. You cannot rebuild 2 years in one evening, she said softly. No. You cannot erase what happened. No. You cannot ask me to become the woman I was before. A faint sadness crossed his face. I would never ask that. A long silence followed. Then Eleanor gave the only answer that felt honest. Perhaps we begin again. The words struck harder than forgiveness. Because they carried possibility. Alexander rose slowly. The crowd erupted into applause. Not for a romance. Not for a title. For something rarer. Humility. Truth. Redemption honestly pursued. Months later, spring returned to Blackthorne Hall. Thomas raced through the gardens laughing as his parents followed behind him. Nothing was perfect. Trust returned slowly. Some scars remained. Certain memories always would. Yet the house no longer felt haunted by absence. One evening Eleanor and Alexander stood together overlooking the blooming grounds while their son chased butterflies beneath the fading sun. The future remained unwritten. For the first time neither feared it. The 7 words that had shattered her heart were never forgotten. But in the end they were no longer the words that defined their story.